Hi there, welcome back. We are going to learn useReducer hook by creating a basic social media app where user can post something and delete. So useReducer hook offers you a better way to manage your state in your component as compared to useState hook. Although useState hook can be used to manage simple state inside your component, but if the state inside your component gets complicated, then we can use useReducer hook as a better alternative to useState hook. So let's start with the code. Here you can see I have opened this app.js file and it has nothing. It's just calling another component called beta microblock. So let us open this. And as you can see, this beta microblock component is also completely empty. Here we are going to create that social media app and we are going to implement useReducer hook, and we'll see how useReducer hook is a better alternative to useState whenever the states management in the component gets complicated. So let's start our useReducer hook. Let's initialize it first, and the initialization is very simple and similar to useState hook that we used to do. Let me just call the useReducer here, and as you can see that useReducer got imported from the React. So in my case it was auto imported by VS Code. Make sure you import it as well. And just like useState expect some initial states to be declared, here useReducer also expects some kind of initial state. But not only that, useReducer also expect some kind of a pure function to be passed on, and we call that function as reducer function. So we can simply pass this function here and we are going to call that function as reducer function. But since this is a social media post where user can write micro blocks, so I'm going to name this function as block reducer. So you can name any of your choice. You can name these functions randomly. And another thing you need to pass here is the initial state, just like useState hook expects you to, but here useReducer hook expects another function called use reducer function as well. Now let us initialize the state here. Okay, so here is that initial state that we are going to declare it. Okay, so I'm going to name it as init state, and it is going to have two properties. The one property is called data, which is going to become an array, and this array is going to hold some object inside it, and it is going to have id, which is going to be date.now, because I want every single post to have its own unique id so that we can delete it later by targeting that id. That's why I'm assigning id to every single post and the post itself. So I'm going to put the post inside the content. So here let's say I'm going to initialize and say React is awesome. Okay, that's all. Now we have initialized the data. Now let me add another property as well. This is going to be empty message, and it is going to check whether the field is empty or not. I'm going to show you in the later cases where we'll be using this empty message. That's all. Now we have initialized the state, and the initial state is we are passing here in the useReducer, and this useReducer is going to give us this initial state in the form of state here. So we are going to receive this initial state as state, and this useReducer hook is also going to give us one more function which is going to be known as dispatch. Okay, so it returns us two properties, not function. The first is state, okay, and then the second is the dispatch function. So let me discuss what this dispatch function is basically. So before I discuss dispatch functions, I also need to discuss this block reducer function as well. So first let me declare the function here, block reducer. So I'm going to write this function as block reducer. Okay, now this block reducer function is also going to expect two different things. The first thing is it is going to expect the state, and then the second thing is it is going to expect the action object. Okay, so what is this action object? Basically this action object will be given to this block reducer, or simply we can call it as a reducer function, by this dispatch function. So when is this dispatch function going to give this action object to this reducer function? Whenever we want to update the data inside this state. So notice like in the use state hook, whenever we want to set the new data inside the use state hook, we used to call set state and pass the new data, and then the state used to get updated. So in our case, we have this dispatch function, and this dispatch function is going to give an action object which is going to contain the action type and then the payload. So action type means what type of action or what type of data we want to update, and the payload means the actual data that we want to update, that's get updated inside the initial state. And who is going to be responsible for updating all those data inside this state? That is going to be handled by block reducer function, or we can simply call it as a reducer function. Okay, so that's how your use reducer hook works. So here we have initialized the use reducer hook. It is taking initial state and returning in the form of state, and it is also giving us this dispatch function. This dispatch function gives us the action object, or passes the action object to this reducer function, and this reducer function, based on the type of action, it updates the state. So I'm going to discuss everything right now. You might be getting confused here, Rajesh, what you're talking about, this dispatch, state, and action. I'm going to show you with examples, so bear with me. Let us create the project first. Okay, so I was just setting off this block reducer function here. Now let me just start with the project, and then I'm going to show you with examples so that you can understand it clearly. So firstly, we are going to create a div which is going to have a class of microblog head. Okay, and there we go. We have created a div with microblog head, and inside this div we are going to write some h2 tag. Okay, so let me make this indentation clear here. So inside this h2 we are going to write what's happening. Okay, and let me align these as well. Let me make the indentation correct. And we are going to have one input type which is going to be text. All right, and let me bring it down. Okay, because I'm going to assign multiple properties inside this input tag here. It is going to have placeholder which is going to say something. All right, that's what it is going to have. And it is also going to have a class name which is going to have blog post. Okay, so we are done with the input. Now we are going to assign a button to it also. So it is also going to have one button which is simply going to say add post. That's all. And obviously the button is going to have some kind of class, and I'm going to name the button as post button. Okay, the class name is simply going to be post button. That's all. Now let me save this code and let me go to the browser, and let me refresh it. Okay, so this is how it looks. So it is saying what's happening. We have this input box and we have this add post button here. So I've made a typo here. The class name is not going to be blog post, it is simply going to be blog input. And now let me save and let me go to the browser, and you can see now it's looking pretty good. So we have this, and here user is going to type some post, and whenever user clicks on this add post button, we are going to showcase new post here in the below. So now you might be thinking like, okay, this button and input element is fine, but from where we are getting all these kinds of styling, color and all? So let me show you. I've already written the css for you here. So these are the css that I have already written, and here I'm not going to discuss css, guys, because I don't want to make this video about css. I want you to explain the importance of use reducer hook. So you can pause the video and watch this css here. You can simply write it down here. Okay, so let us move ahead with the code itself. And we all know that we have already initialized one single piece of post here. Now we need to render this post as well. So how do we render it? It's pretty simple. So let us render that post which we have here. So in order to access that, we need to use this state variable which is given by the use reducer to us. So we are going to say simply state.data, and that's how we are going to access the data. Okay, so let me open the curly braces, and I'm simply going to say state.data.map, and I'm going to take every single individual post, and I want to return some JSX obviously here. Okay, so I need to manually type it, and it is not helping me out here. Okay, now I need to add a class also here, and the class name is going to be post content. All right, and it is also going to have unique key, which is simply going to be post.id, because like we all know that every single post is going to have its own unique id. Now let us come here and let us write the post, and let me write a p tag here, paragraph tag. Here I'm going to assign the post. So in order to get the post, we just need to say post.content. As we all know that post is stored inside this content property, and we are going to add one more button, which is going to be a delete button to delete the post. All right, and let me close this div quickly here, and let me add the class also here. So this is going to be simply, okay, typo, it is simply going to be delete button, that's all, and it is going to say delete. Okay, that's all. Now let me save the post, let me save the code, and let us go here, and as you can see, we got our post here. Now the project skeleton is ready. Now we just need to add functionality. We need to add the functionality that whenever user types some post and clicks on this add post button, we need to add the post here, and if user clicks on this delete button, the post needs to be deleted. And also, let's just say if the field is empty and user simply hits the add button, then we want to display an error message above, which is going to say please write something. Okay, so we are going to add all this functionality, and we are going to see how useReducer is going to help us to do so. Okay, so let's just start with the functionality. So first, let's just start with adding the post. So we are going to add on click method here, and it is simply going to say add post. Now let me declare this function. So I'm going to declare it on top of this useReducer function here, and I'm simply going to say function and add post, that's all. Now in order to add the post, first I want to grab whatever the user is typing inside this input field. Now in order to grab that, we have a hook called useRef, which is going to help us. So let me call that hook. So here I'm simply going to name this as post input, and I'm going to call this useRef hook, which is going to help me to grab that value whatever the user is typing inside the input. Okay, so it's not auto importing for me, so let me try to auto import it. Okay, here now it is auto importing here. Okay, fine. Now let me copy this post input here, and let me come to this input, and here I'm simply going to write ref, and I'm going to pass post input here. Now by doing so, now I can access whatever the user is typing inside this input field by just using this post input.current.value. If I do so, then I'm going to get whatever the value that user is typing inside the input field. Okay, so let us come inside this add post function here, and we are simply going to say const, and we are going to call it as input value variable, and here we are going to say post input dot current dot value. And okay, now here this input value variable is going to store whatever the user is typing inside that input field. Now we want to add that data inside this state. So how do we do that? We can do that using this dispatch function. But before we add those data inside this state, we need to check whether the field is empty or not. What if the user is not typing anything on the field and it is simply clicking the add post button? So at that time we can add an if statement here, and we are going to say if input value is not equals to empty. It simply means that only if there is something that user has written, then only we are going to process this function. Okay, now in order to pass that value inside this state, we need to call this dispatch function. Now this dispatch function is going to help us to do so. Okay, so now let me call the dispatch function here, and as I told you that this dispatch function is going to give an action object to this block reducer function. So let me pass that action object. Now this action object is going to contain two values. The first is the type of an action. So what type of action the user is performing on the web page? Well, the user is trying to add and post. So I'm going to name this type of action as add post. Okay, so you can name whatever you want. Since user is trying to add some post, so I'm going to name the type of action as add post. And then the second thing is going to be payload. Payload means that particular data or the post which we want to add inside this state object. So the payload is going to be the setup data. So first let me call an array, and here simply I'm going to say state dot data. So by doing so, here as you can see, the data is stored inside the array. So that's why I'm initializing an array here, and I'm destructuring all the data that was stored previously. By doing so, that's why I'm getting all this data here. And after that, I'm going to add one more new post that user has created. And as you know that we need to assign unique ID to all the posts, so I'm going to set date.now here, and I also need to pass the content here, so whatever the user has written, and that content is inside this input value variable. So let me pass this here, and we need to pass one more property here. Okay, so we won't be passing any property here, that we'll be doing here in the reducer function. Okay, so we are done with the dispatched function here. So we are passing this action object to this reducer function here. So now let us write some code inside this block reducer function. So here we are going to write some switch case here, and this switch is going to check the type of an action. So that's why we are going to say action dot type, and we are simply going to check the type of an action. So we are going to write the case as add post. So if the type of an action is add post, then we want to do something. So what do we want to do? We want to return new state here. Sorry for the fumble out there. So why we're returning a new state is because this block reducer or reducer function is a pure function. So pure function means it is simply going to return a new data. It is not going to update the state inside this state object. It is simply going to return as a new state object which is going to be replaced here. So that's why I'm writing this return keyword. And now let me destructure all the state here. Okay, and let me pass the data, and this data is simply going to be action dot payload, and we all know what is payload. So this is the entire post that this payload value is holding here, and that's what we are passing here by doing action dot payload. And we all know that it is also having another value called empty message, so we also need to pass this, and this empty message is simply going to be false here. That's all. Now we also need to write some default case. So what if somehow this reducer function got triggered but there is no such action being done by the user? So we need to write some default case. So in default we are simply going to return the existing state, so whatever the state we have. So for that we are simply going to destructure the state, and we are simply going to return the existing state itself. So this post might be working now. So this functionality might be working now. Let us go to the browser, let me refresh it, and let us test it. So here I'm simply going to write learning useReducer hook. Okay, now let me add the post, and as you all know it's working here. But the one thing we need to add is, like, as soon as user add the post, this field needs to be clean. Okay, and another thing we need to take care of is, like, whenever I'm clicking on this add post, I want to display some empty error message here, which is going to say please write something. So let us implement that also here. Okay, and let us clear that empty field also. So that is going to be pretty simple. So let us come here, and here let me open the curly braces, and I'm simply going to say state dot empty message. Now if empty message is true, then I'm going to display the error message. All right, and let me close the div, and it is also definitely going to have some class, and that class is going to be empty message. Okay, and let me pass the message as please write something. Cool. And if the message is not empty, then we are simply going to display null. So null means we are not going to display anything. Okay, so here we all know that this empty message is false by default, so we need to turn this empty message variable to true whenever user click the add post button with empty field. So we can do that inside this add post method here. So if the value is not uh, filled by user, if it is empty, then we are going to pass a new dispatch uh, here, and we are going to pass new action object which is going to have a type called empty message here. Okay, I'm going to name this type as empty message, and it is going to have payload which is going to be true. And now let me copy this type here, and let us come to this reducer function here, and let me add a new case. Okay, so here this case is going to be an empty message. All right, and if the message is empty, then we are going to return new state here. Let me destructure the entire state here first, and after that I'm going to pass this empty message value as action dot payload, and this action dot payload is basically true. Now this empty message got converted into true, and now if it is true, then we are going to display this error message. Now other thing we need to do is we need to clear that input field value as well, and that is pretty simple, just a one liner code. We just need to say post input dot current dot value, which is going to be empty. And if you're wondering what is post input, then notice that we have already grabbed the input field using this useRef hook here. Inside this input, we are assigning this post input, and we are grabbing this input, and we are simply going to say post input current dot value means whatever the user has typed, we are converting that into empty string. So that's how we are clearing it, and we are simply going to write the return method here. Okay, and okay, now let us go to the browser. Let me refresh it. Okay, now let me try to add something here empty, and you can see the message please write something. Now let me try to add some post here. So let me write here working on some Redux project, and let me add this post, and as you can see the error message went away and we successfully added our new post. Now let us try to work on deleting this post here. Right now we cannot delete it, so let us work on adding this delete functionality. So here we need to come inside this delete button here, and we need to pass an on click method here, and this is simply going to return a function which is going to have delete post method. Okay, and this delete post function is going to pass the post id. And why we are passing the unique post id? Because we want to delete that unique id whichever the post the user wants to delete, and we can grab that unique post by using its id, because we all know that each post is having its own unique id. Now let me define this delete post here. Okay, so here we have defined our add post function. So here below that I'm going to declare that delete post, and here it is going to take the post id. Okay, and let me come inside this function, and we are going to call our dispatch function, which is again going to pass an action object to the reducer function, right? And this action object is going to have type. Now since user wants to delete the post, so I'm going to name the type as delete post. That's all, and it is going to have payload as well. So payload is nothing but it is going to be the filter sets of data, whatever the data is left after deleting a unique post. So that we can do by destructuring the state dot data. So by doing so, we got whatever the post that was stored inside this data. Now from that we need to filter out those data, or we need to delete that data whichever the user wants to delete it, and that we can do using the filter method here. So let me do that here. So I'm simply going to say filter, and I'm going to write post here, and I'm going to say if post dot id is not equals to post id. So by doing so, we are able to delete our post here. Okay, now the delete functionality also should work. Now let us go to our page. Let me refresh here and let me try to add some post here. So let me type useReducer hook is awesome. Okay, let me add this post and let me add one more post. Let me type going to the gym. Okay, and now let me try to delete it, and as soon as I click on delete button, it is not working. So it might be throwing some error. So let us open the console. Okay, so it is not throwing any error. So let us go to our code base and let us try to debug what is happening here. Okay, we made a silly mistake. We forgot to write code inside this reducer. Reducer is responsible for updating the state, right? And we haven't write that case inside the reducer function. So let us create a case for delete post. So that was a pretty silly mistake. Okay, now let me copy this action type. It is going to be delete post here. Okay, and if it is delete post, then again we are going to return new state here, and we are going to this structure here. Let me write state, and it is going to have data as well, not date. It is going to be data, which is going to be action dot payload, and we have another property called empty message, which is definitely going to be false. All right, now it should be working. So let us go to the browser. Let me refresh it, and now let me write that post again. Let me write that going to the gym post, and let me write another post called learning React use reducer hook, and let me add the post, and let me try to delete the post. Now if I hit on this delete button, as you can see, now it's working and I can delete all the posts. And let me refresh, and I got my hard-coded post back. So now all the functionality are completely working, and we implemented all this using the useReducer hook. I hope now you understood useReducer hook. Let me summarize it quickly here. So first, what is going to happen is some action is going to be triggered by the user end. Okay, and let's just say user want to add the post. We are going to trigger that add post function, and what is going to happen is we are going to call this dispatch function. So let me go to this add post function, and we are going to call this dispatch function, and this dispatch function is going to pass an action object, and this action object is going to contain two different properties. The first is type, which is going to say what type of action is done by the user, and the second property is the payload, which is going to contain the data that needs to be updated. So this is what this dispatch function is going to pass, and it is going to pass inside this reducer function. So in our case, we named it as block reducer, and this block reducer function is going to take two things, the state and then the action, and it is going to check what type of action is done by the user. And let's just say here user try to add the post, so it is going to run the script, and here it is going to update that state, and it is going to return the new state, and that new state is going to get reflected on the web page. Now some of you might be saying that, hey, this is complicated. Use state hook was pretty simple. Why do we need to use this complicated use reducer hook? And trust me guys, when I said it, whenever your state gets complicated inside your component, whenever you are working on a large scale application, at that point of time, using use state hook is not a good idea. Using use reducer hook is going to help you to manage your code in a clean and maintainable way, and it is going to improve the quality of your code. I hope you understood useReducer hook. If you didn't understood, make sure you watch it for the second time also to understand it better. And I'm going to come up with another new video next time. Till then, subscribe to my channel.